The darkness of the Vietnamese jungle has always been impenetrable, but there was something beyond bullets and ambushes that worried American soldiers during those dark years of war. As the sun set over the dense canopies of tropical trees, a completely different realm awoke. A world where danger came not only from enemy rifles, but from creatures that inhabited that land thousands of years ago, long before any human conflict ever set foot on that sacred ground. This is the rarely told story about the true nocturnal predators of Vietnam, those who did not distinguish between American or Vietnamese uniforms, those who followed only their primitive instincts of survival and hunting. Get ready to meet the creatures that made Vietnamese nights challenging for thousands of young soldiers who never imagined facing enemies as old as nature itself. If you are enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you are watching this video. Your participation is key to continuing to bring fascinating stories like this. It was the year of 967 when soldier James Miller first stepped on Vietnamese soil. Coming from a small town in inland Kansas, where nighttime dangers boiled down to distant coyotes and occasional storms, James was unprepared for what he would find in the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia. No military training could have prepared him properly. In the first few weeks, like most newly arrived recruits, their biggest concern was the Viet Cong ambushes, traps hidden under foliage, and sudden shootings that could erupt at any time. But on the third night of patrol, when his unit set up camp in a clearing near the Mekong Delta, James discovered that there were much older threats lurking in the shadows. The moist air carried strange sounds that night. It was not just the common noises of the jungle, that incessant choral of insects and nocturnal birds that had become familiar. There was something different, something that made the hairs on the back of the neck instinctively shiver. Veteran soldiers were on alert in a way that went beyond standard military surveillance. His eyes scanned the tree line with an intensity that suggested knowledge of previous experiences that novices did not yet share. A sergeant named Rodriguez, who was on his second tour in Vietnam, whispered to the recruits to keep their boots tied tightly, no matter how much their feet hurt or sweat. When asked why, he simply replied that they would learn soon. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, when the moon was obscured by dense clouds and the darkness was almost palpable, the first cry echoed through the camp. It was not a cry of combat or of someone wounded by enemy fire. It was an intense cry of alarm, the kind of sound that emerges when someone is faced with something completely unexpected. James and the other soldiers grabbed their weapons and ran toward the sound, their flashlights cutting through the darkness into beams of light. What they found would leave them scarred forever. The soldier who had shouted was standing, pale even under the dirt and camouflage, pointing at something on the ground. There, just a few inches from where his foot had been moments before, was one of the deadliest creatures in Southeast Asia. A Russell viper, with its distinctive chain-shaped marks along its thick, muscular body, was curled up in a defensive position, its triangular head raised and ready to attack. But it wasn't just a serpent. As the lanterns lit up the surrounding area, the soldiers realized with increasing concern that they were literally surrounded by these creatures. Dozens of them had stormed the camp's perimeter, drawn by the warmth of human bodies and perhaps the abundance of rodents that always followed military camps in search of food scraps. Rodriguez kept his cool, instructing everyone to remain absolutely still. With slow and deliberate movements, he began to guide the men out of the infested area, step by step careful, every move calculated not to provoke a defensive attack. It took almost 40 minutes to completely evacuate that section of camp, 40 minutes of absolute tension where every breath seemed too high, every heartbeat seemed to reverberate in silence. When they finally achieved relative safety, Rodriguez explained that Russell's vipers were responsible for more fatalities in Southeast Asia than any other species of snake. Its venom was hemotoxic, affecting tissues and blood cells. Without proper treatment, a single bite could be fatal within hours, and in the conditions of the Vietnamese jungle, proper treatment was often impossible to get in time. That night was just the beginning for James Miller and his unit. In the weeks that followed, they would learn that Russell's viper was just one of the many reptilian threats that inhabited that land. There were the Nagas, with their distinctive cloaks and ability to spit poison at astonishing distances, specifically targeting the eyes of their victims to cause temporary blindness and significant pain. There were the krites, serpents extremely shy during the day, but that became defensive at night, their neurotoxic venom capable of affecting the nervous system. And there were the pythons, which although not poisonous, were powerful creatures with their muscular bodies of 6 meters or more, being able to move with surprising silence through the dense vegetation. Official reports rarely mentioned these occurrences. When a soldier was affected by snakebite, it was often recorded simply as a non-combative low, an administrative category. But among the soldiers, the stories circulated. History after history of men who had survived intense shootings only to face these natural dangers. Stories of soldiers waking up with snakes wrapped in their sleeping bags, drawn to body heat during cold jungle nights. Stories of nocturnal sentinels who needed urgent medical help after encounters with poisonous fauna. A military doctor named Dr. Harrison, who served in several field hospitals in Vietnam, later estimated that venomous snakes accounted for approximately 5% of all American casualties in certain regions of the country. 5% may not seem like much statistically, but when translated into actual impact on young soldiers, the number was significant. And these were just the occurrences recorded. How many soldiers were bitten but never reported for fear of appearing weak? How many survived but carried long-term sequelae due to the effects of the poison? But snakes were not the only nocturnal predators haunting the Vietnamese jungles. There were even more peculiar creatures, even more impressive in their strangeness. The giant scorpions of the forest, for example, with their bodies that could reach the length of an adult human hand, their powerful tweezers capable of breaking the skin and their stinger loaded with neurotoxins that caused significant pain. Soldiers reported waking up in the middle of the night with these creatures walking on their bodies, attracted by moisture and heat. The protocol was to remain absolutely still, barely breathing, while the scorpion completed its nocturnal journey. Any sudden movement, any attempt to scare the creature away, could result in a defensive sting. And then there were the spiders. Vietnam was home to some of the largest species of spiders in the world, including giant Asian tarantulas, whose legs could span a length larger than a dinner plate. Although generally not lethal to healthy adult humans, their bites were extremely painful and often resulted in secondary infections in the unsanitary conditions of the jungle. Worse still were Asian black widows and other truly poisonous spider species who built their webs in places where soldiers often laid their hands without looking, abandoned burrows, equipment left overnight, even inside helmets and boots left outside the tents. Private Marcus Chen, a combat doctor of Chinese-American origin, developed an unofficial protocol for dealing with bites and stings of poisonous creatures in the field. He carried a special kit that included light tourniquets, broad-spectrum antivenom syringes when available, and instruments for making small incisions and venom suction, although this latter practice was controversial even at that time. Marcus said that in his first year in Vietnam, he treated more cases of creature poisoning than gunshot wounds. This may seem far-fetched, but his unit operated mostly in dense jungle areas, far from major combat zones, where contact with wild nature was inevitable and constant. One of the stories Marcus told involved a soldier named Tommy Wright, a young man from Texas who prided himself on his courage and endurance. Tommy had been bitten by a cobra during a night patrol. The serpent had attacked defensively when he almost stepped on it while crossing a stream. Marcus was called immediately, but the poison was already taking effect. Tommy began to exhibit neurological symptoms quickly, including blurred vision and difficulty breathing. Marcus administered the antivenom he had available, but it was not specific to that kind of cobra. Over the next 6 hours, while waiting for medical evacuation that was hampered by adverse weather and the impossibility of landing helicopters in the dense jungle, Marcus worked hard to keep Tommy stable, providing respiratory support and ongoing care. Miraculously, Tommy survived. When he was finally evacuated and given proper treatment at a base hospital, he regained most of his functions, although he was left with permanent nerve damage to one leg. Marcus never forgot that night, not only because of the medical challenge, but because it perfectly illustrated the vulnerability of soldiers in the face of these natural threats. All the military training in the world, all the advanced weapons and equipment, meant nothing when they faced creatures that had perfected their biological weapons over millions of years of evolution. But perhaps no creature was as universally feared as the saltwater crocodiles that inhabited the mangroves and deltas of Vietnam. These prehistoric reptiles, which could grow up to 6 feet long and weigh over 1,000 pounds, were true living dinosaurs. During the day, they remained mostly submerged, only their eyes and nostrils visible above the surface of the muddy water. But when it got dark, they became active hunters, patrolling the banks of rivers and canals in search of prey. And for a saltwater crocodile, a human soldier was simply another potential prey. Sergeant William Thompson had a story that told only to soldiers who showed genuine interest and courage to listen. It was about a river patrol that went terribly wrong. His unit was sailing in small boats through a narrow channel in the Mekong Delta, carrying supplies to an isolated outpost. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set, tinting the water with orange and red hues that, retrospectively, looked ominous. The engine of one of the boats began to fail, forcing them to stop for repairs. While the mechanic worked, the other soldiers kept watch, looking for signs of enemy activity on the densely vegetated shores. These predators are masters of aquatic invisibility, able to move without creating noticeable ripples on the surface. The first sign of danger was when the soldier standing at the stern of the boat simply disappeared. There was no warning cry, no fighting sound. One moment he was there, the next moment there was an empty space and ripples expanding in the dark water. It took several precious seconds for others to process what had happened. When they finally reacted, trying to locate the soldier, it was too late. The crocodile had dragged its victim into the muddy depths. The soldier's body was never recovered. Thompson and his unit stayed in that area for nearly 2 days, searching, but the current and action of aquatic predators meant there was little hope of finding anything. That experience fundamentally changed how Thompson viewed the war in Vietnam. He realized that they were fighting not only against a human enemy, but against the very nature of a land that did not want them there. Every river, every forest, every swamp hid dangers that had existed long before humans invented wars, and that would continue to exist long after all battles were forgotten. Crocodiles were not the only aquatic predators that posed a threat. Electric eels, while not lethal in most cases, could generate shocks of up to 600 volts, enough to temporarily incapacitate an adult male, potentially causing drowning if the shock occurred in deep water. There were also the giant Mekong catfish, creatures that could weigh 300 pounds or more, usually harmless but occasionally responsible for accidents when frightened. And naturally, there were countless species of poisonous water snakes that swam through rivers and swamps, virtually invisible in the murky water. But going back to the terrestrial creatures, there was one particularly problematic group that deserves special attention: the giant centipedes. Vietnam is home to some of the largest centipede species in the world, creatures that can reach lengths of 30 centimeters or more. These carnivorous arthropods are equipped with venomous forcipules, modified appendages just behind the head that function as venom-injecting prey. Although rarely lethal to healthy adult humans, their bites can cause painful reactions and often result in swelling, fever, and local tissue damage. Worse still, these creatures were lured to military camps, where they found plenty of smaller insects to hunt, and did not hesitate to enter tents, backpacks, and even clothes left on the ground. There were stories, never fully verified but persistent enough to seem plausible, of soldiers who had been bitten by centipedes in their sleep. In one specific case that circulated widely, a soldier would have woken up with a giant centipede walking over his face. Instinctively, he tried to scare him away, only to be bitten in the hands. The venom caused significant swelling that required urgent medical treatment. Stories like this, true or exaggerated, contributed to the atmosphere of caution that permeated the nights in the Vietnamese jungle. And we cannot forget about the smallest but no less dangerous insects. Mosquitoes, for example, were more than just an annoying nuisance. They were vectors of devastating diseases. Malaria was endemic in Vietnam, and despite preventive measures such as chloroquine tablets and use of mosquito nets, thousands of American soldiers contracted the disease. Dengue, transmitted by the Aedes mosquito, caused debilitating fevers and joint pain so severe that it was known as bone-breaking fever. In severe cases, it could progress to dengue hemorrhagic fever, a potentially fatal condition. Japanese encephalitis, another mosquito-borne disease, caused brain inflammation that could result in permanent neurological damage or death. The ticks and fleas of the Vietnamese jungle carried their own diseases. Flea-borne typhus, tick-borne spotted fever, and various other ailments made each insect bite a potential debilitating illness sentence. Soldiers developed elaborate rituals of body inspection, checking each other for ticks stuck together, applying repellents with almost obsessive frequency, burning leeches that clung to the skin during crossings of streams and swamps. Ah yes, the leeches. These creatures deserve special mention for the psychological frustration they caused. Although not directly lethal, leeches were ubiquitous in moist environments, and their ability to infiltrate through clothing and attach to skin without being noticed was deeply disturbing to many soldiers. When discovered, they were often already swollen with blood, and removing them incorrectly could leave their jaws stuck in the skin, causing infections. The sight of a fat bloodsucker hanging from his leg or arm was something many veterans could never forget, even decades after leaving Vietnam. But perhaps the most psychologically impactful creatures were not the venomous or the predatory, but rather those that were simply alien in their appearance and behavior. Vietnam is home to extraordinary biodiversity, including insects of sizes and shapes that defied the experience of soldiers coming from the temperate zones of America. Mouse-sized beetles, moths with wingspans larger than human hands, crickets that made deafening noises at night, all contributed to a sense of being in a completely strange and hostile world. Private Richard Hayes, who served as a combat photographer, extensively documented the wildlife he encountered. He was particularly fascinated by a species of rhinoceros beetle he encountered, a fist-sized creature with elaborate horns and a shell that looked like medieval armor. But even this harmless species had its disturbing characteristics. When threatened, it produced a loud hissing sound that sounded terribly similar to that of a snake, an evolutionary defense mechanism that exploited the innate fears of potential predators. As the months turned into years for those soldiers who survived and completed multiple service tours, a kind of collective knowledge developed about how to coexist with the creatures of the Vietnamese jungle. Experienced veterans taught novices survival tricks that did not come from any official military manual. Always check boots before putting them on, shaking them vigorously to dislodge any creature that might have taken shelter there at night. Never put your hands in places you couldn't see first. Always use a stick to probe dense vegetation before passing through it. Avoid walking near bodies of water at dawn or dusk, when crocodiles were most active. Never pursue or attempt to kill snakes unless absolutely necessary, for even mortally wounded serpents could bite reflexively. Superstitions and almost mystical beliefs about certain creatures also developed. Some soldiers believed that the occasionally sighted albino white snakes were signs of good luck, while seeing a black snake in the shape of a bow was an omen of imminent death. Others believed that certain animals, particularly tigers that still inhabited remote parts of the jungle, were spirits of dead warriors. These beliefs, while rationally unfounded, provided a framework for processing the constant fear and unpredictability of jungle life. Speaking of tigers, although rare and generally avoiding human contact, there were occasional reports of encounters. The Indo-Chinese tiger, a subspecies smaller than the Bengal tiger but still formidable, inhabited the most remote forests. Soldiers on deep patrols occasionally found fresh tracks or heard the characteristic roars echoing through the forest at night. There were stories, never fully confirmed, of tigers occasionally approaching human areas. One persistent account spoke of a tiger supposedly following a unit for 3 consecutive days, always keeping his distance but leaving clear signs of his presence, footprints in the mud and claw marks on trees. But going back to the most common and statistically significant threats, it is important to understand that it was not just the individually dangerous creatures that caused problems. It was the cumulative effect, the constant psychological wear and tear of never being able to let down your guard, even during periods of rest. A soldier could survive intense combat, demonstrate extraordinary courage under enemy fire, but then face significant emotional challenges from the experience of waking up night after night with spiders walking over his face, or discovering yet another leech trapped in his body, or hearing something large moving in the nearby darkness, not knowing whether it was a harmless animal or a potential predator. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a military psychologist who has studied combat stress in Vietnam veterans, identified what she called ecological stress as a significant but often overlooked factor in the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. According to their research, Soldiers who had served in dense jungle environments disproportionately reported nightmares involving hostile creatures and natural environments, even decades after returning home. The inability to trust their environment, the need for constant vigilance against threats coming not just from other humans but from the entire surrounding ecosystem, left deep psychological marks. There was also the cultural aspect of how American and Vietnamese soldiers perceived these creatures differently. For many Vietnamese, particularly those who had grown up in rural areas, venomous snakes and other dangerous creatures were simply part of life, something to be respected and avoided but not paralyzedly feared. They possessed traditional knowledge passed down through generations about how to identify species, how to treat bites using local medicinal plants, how to predict animal behavior based on subtle signals from the environment. Soldiers of the Viet Cong, operating in their home territory, had significant advantages in this regard. They knew which trails to avoid during certain seasons when snakes were most active. They knew specific trees whose leaves could be used to repel insects. They understood the rhythms of the jungle so that foreigners could never fully learn, no matter how much time they spent there. Some American military advisors tried to learn from the local Vietnamese, recognizing that this ecological knowledge was as valuable as military intelligence. Occasionally, informal trainings were organized where villagers or South Vietnamese soldiers taught Americans basic survival skills in the jungle. But the language barrier, cultural differences, and simply the lack of necessary life experience meant that much of this knowledge remained inaccessible to most American soldiers. They learned through direct, often painful experience, a method of education that cost injuries, illnesses, and lives. It is also important to mention that not all creatures of the Vietnamese jungle were dangerous. There was extraordinary beauty in the biodiversity of the region. Birds of dazzling plumage, butterflies larger than human hands in impossible colors, unique small mammals found nowhere else on Earth. Some soldiers found solace in observing this wildlife, brief moments where they could forget about the war and simply enjoy the natural wonder around. Richard Hayes, the photographer mentioned earlier, collected thousands of images not only of combat but of Vietnamese flora and fauna. He said these photographs kept him sane, providing a purpose beyond destruction, a way to document beauty amidst hardship. But even the seemingly harmless creatures could present unexpected dangers. Bats, for example, were vectors of rabies, an invariably fatal disease once symptoms manifested. Monkeys and other primates, while fascinating to watch, could be surprisingly aggressive when they felt threatened or when they protected their young, and their bites carried a risk of serious infections. Wild pigs, especially large males, were dangerous when cornered, their prey capable of causing devastating injuries. Even domesticated water buffalo, commonly used by Vietnamese farmers, were extremely territorial and could attack if they felt threatened. Private Antoine Jackson had a story about water buffalo that perfectly illustrated how even domestic animals could be dangerous in war situations. During a patrol through rice paddies, his unit encountered a seemingly abandoned buffalo. The animal, probably frightened by the sounds of recent combat in the area, was agitated and defensive. One of the younger soldiers, raised on a farm and thinking he knew how to handle cattle, tried to approach the buffalo to get him out of the way. The animal invested with astonishing speed, its curved horns directed directly at the soldier. Only the rapid intervention of other members of the unit, using warning shots and noise to scare the buffalo, prevented a serious injury or death. The incident served as a reminder that in a war zone even normally tame animals could become unpredictable and dangerous. As the war dragged on, there were also reports of animals that seemed to have learned to associate certain human sounds and behaviors with danger or opportunity. Crocodiles that supposedly gathered near frequent combat areas. Vultures and other butcher birds that followed military units. Rats that infested military bases in ever-increasing numbers, adapting perfectly to human presence and becoming increasingly bold in their search for food. These mice were not only bothersome, they carried disease, gnawed at equipment, and their constant presence was yet another stressor for already exhausted soldiers. On some larger bases, efforts were made to control rat populations using cats, but this often resulted in new problems when cats became wild or were themselves attacked by snakes and other predators. The Vietnamese jungle had its own balances and rhythms, and the war had disturbed them in ways that created unexpected consequences. There was also the deliberate use of knowledge about dangerous wildlife as a tactic of war. There were reports, though difficult to fully confirm, that Viet Cong guerrillas occasionally used poisonous snakes as weapons, placing them on tracks known to be used by American patrols, or even in traps specifically designed to force soldiers through snake-infested areas. While it is possible that some of these accounts were exaggerated or based on misinterpretation of situations, the mere possibility that human enemies were deliberately mobilizing dangerous creatures added another layer of paranoia and fear. On the American side, there were attempts to use trained animals for various purposes. War dogs were common, used to detect mines, ambushes, and tunnels. But the Vietnamese jungle environment was extraordinarily challenging even for these highly trained animals. Many war dogs have suffered from tropical diseases, snake bites, or heat exhaustion. There were also experimental programs using dolphins to detect water mines and even birds trained to detect odors associated with explosives, but none of these programs proved to be as effective as expected in the actual conditions of war. One rarely discussed aspect is how the war itself affected wildlife populations. Extensive military operations, use of herbicides such as Agent Orange to destroy forest cover, and large-scale displacement of human populations have had profound ecological impacts. Species that depended on specific habitats were severely affected. Others, particularly those adaptable to disturbed environments, have proliferated. The war fundamentally reshaped entire ecosystems, effects that persist to this day. Agent Orange, specifically, had unintended but significant consequences for wildlife. Although intended to eliminate vegetation cover, the herbicide affected the entire ecosystem. Animals that depended on vegetation for food and shelter were forced to migrate. Humans, both American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians, who have been exposed to the chemical, have developed serious health problems over the years. The environmental effects of this substance have demonstrated how interventions in complex ecosystems can have long-lasting and unpredictable consequences. But returning to the individual experiences of soldiers, it is crucial to understand that the fear of these creatures was not irrational or cowardly. It was a completely appropriate response to real and often lethal threats. A soldier who kept constant watch against snakes and other dangers was not paranoid. He was being prudent and increasing his chances of survival. The problem was that this constant vigilance was mentally and physically exhausting. Soldiers needed to divide their attention between human and natural threats, and this division of focus could prove fatal in both contexts. There was also the issue of limited medical resources. On major bases, there was generally access to antivenoms and appropriate treatments for bites and stings. But units on deep patrol in the jungle were often hours or days away from any proper medical facility. Fighting doctors did their best with limited supplies, but there were limits to what could be done on the field. Many soldiers died not because their wounds were necessarily fatal, but because proper treatment could not be provided in time. This was true for both combat injuries and for bites and stings of poisonous creatures. Lieutenant Michael Rodriguez, who served as a battalion doctor, developed innovative protocols for dealing with wildlife-related emergencies. He trained all members of his unit in basic first aid for snake bites, including recognizing symptoms and administering supportive treatment while awaiting evacuation. He also kept meticulous records of each incident involving dangerous creatures, documenting species when possible, symptoms, applied treatments, and results. His records later became valuable resources for the medical understanding of poisonings by tropical fauna. Rodriguez recounted a particularly memorable incident involving a soldier who had been stung by a giant forest scorpion. The soldier, a young man named David Chun, experienced a severe reaction to the poison. Rodriguez administered potent painkillers, intravenous fluids to maintain blood pressure, and appropriate medication. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. Scorpio venom, though rarely lethal to healthy adults, could be unpredictable in its effects, especially when combined with the physical stress of military service in jungle conditions. Eventually, Chun stabilized and survived, but carried nerve sensitivity at the bite site for the rest of his life. Stories like this circulated among the units, serving as both warnings and lessons about what to do in similar situations. Practical knowledge was transmitted through oral narratives, supplementing formal training that often did not adequately cover the specific realities of the Vietnamese environment. Experienced veterans have become valuable resources. Their experiences turned into survival wisdom. But not all knowledge transmitted was accurate or useful. Myths and incorrect information also spread. Some units mistakenly believed that all serpents with triangular heads were poisonous, leading to unnecessary extermination of harmless species. Others believed that rattles made noise before attacking, not realizing that many Asian venomous snakes attacked silently. There were beliefs that urine could neutralize jellyfish venom, that cutting and sucking venom from snake bites was effective, that tight tourniquets prevented venom from spreading. Many of these beliefs were not only useless but actively harmful, potentially worsening injury or delaying appropriate treatment. Formal education about dangerous wildlife was inconsistent and often inadequate. Some commanders recognized the importance and organized regular briefings with experts when available. Others treated the subject as secondary compared to combat training. This variation meant that some units were relatively well prepared to deal with natural threats, while others learned only through direct experience. Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the few female medical officers serving in Vietnam, became a vocal advocate for better training on wildlife dangers. She argued that each soldier affected by snakebite or scorpion bite represented a loss as significant as any caused by enemy action. She pressed superiors to include mandatory training on dangerous wildlife identification and appropriate first aid. Some of their efforts were successful, resulting in improved training programs in certain divisions, but systemic change was slowly and often resisted by those who saw such concerns as distractions from the main military mission. As the war neared its end, and American soldiers began to be withdrawn from Vietnam, many carried with them not only physical scars but vivid memories of these encounters with the wild nature of the country. For some, these memories were as impactful as any combat they had experienced. Veterans reported recurring nightmares about snakes, waking in panic thinking there was something creeping on them. Others developed phobias of insects, reptiles, or dense forest environments, which affected their lives years or decades after returning home. But there were also those who developed deep respect and even fascination for Vietnamese wildlife. Richard Hayes, the photographer, eventually became a nature documentary filmmaker, returning to Vietnam in peacetime to photograph the same creatures that once challenged him. He said that understanding these creatures, learning about their ecological roles and behaviors, helped process their experiences during the war. Turning fear into knowledge has become a form of healing. Dr. Marcus Chun, the combat physician, devoted his post-military career to the study of tropical poisons and development of better antivenoms. His experiences in Vietnam convinced him that medical knowledge about exotic wildlife poisonings was inadequate and that further research was desperately needed. He has established partnerships with Vietnamese institutions, working to improve both antivenoms and public education about first aid for bites and stings. His work saved countless lives in the decades that followed, a way of giving meaning to the suffering he had witnessed during the war. Other veterans engaged in conservation efforts, acknowledging that the war had devastated Vietnamese ecosystems and that restoration work was needed. They returned to Vietnam as volunteers on reforestation projects, habitat protection, and biodiversity research. For some, this work was a form of redemption, a way to help heal a land they had helped to hurt. It was also a way of reconnecting with a country that had marked them so deeply, but under completely different circumstances. It is also important to recognize the impact on Vietnamese civilians, who have lived with these dangerous creatures not for months or years, but for entire lives. For them, the war had intensified already existing dangers. Minefields forced people to use narrow trails where snake encounters were more likely. Population displacement put people in contact with wild environments they were unfamiliar with. Destruction of natural habitats forced predators to enter inhabited areas in search of food. War multiplied suffering in ways that went far beyond direct combat. Vietnamese women and children working in the rice paddies were particularly vulnerable. His bare hands and feet in the muddy water were constantly exposed to water snakes, leeches, and other dangers. There were no military boots or protective equipment for them, only traditional knowledge and constant vigilance. Many faced serious health risks from snake bites or scorpion stings, situations rarely recorded or recognized in the historical annals of the war. And so, When we reflect on Vietnam, we need to remember that the war was fought on multiple levels. There was human warfare with its tactics, strategies, and political motivations. But there was also an older, more fundamental war between humans and nature, between the fragility of the human body and the biological weapons perfected by millions of years of evolution. The nocturnal creatures of Vietnam knew no politics or ideology. They simply followed their instincts, hunting, defending themselves, surviving the only way they knew how. For the American soldiers who faced these creatures, the experience was transformative. They learned humility in the face of a natural world that did not care about their superior technology or military training. They learned that courage in combat did not protect them against the venom of a snake or the jaws of a crocodile. They learned that constant vigilance was the price of survival, not only against human enemies but against the entire web of life around them. And perhaps more importantly, some have learned respect. Respect for the complexity of tropical ecosystems, for the evolutionary ingenuity of the creatures that inhabit them, for the interconnection of all life. This respect, born of fear and suffering, eventually turned into something more constructive for those who chose this path. It has become the basis for conservation, for scientific research, for education, for healing. The nocturnal creatures of Vietnam remain there today, long after the last American soldiers left, long after the guns have been silenced. They patrol the same jungles, hunt the same prey, follow the same rhythms they have followed for eons. The war was only a brief moment in its continued existence, a temporary disturbance that eventually passed. They are supreme survivors, perfectly adapted to their environments, indifferent to the human dramas that unfold around them. For us, looking back through the decades, these stories serve as powerful reminders. Reminders that nature is not a passive background for human conflict, but an active participant with its own powers and dangers. Reminders that even in the most controlled and militarized contexts, natural forces can reassert their primacy. Reminders that respect for nature is not optional luxury but a fundamental necessity for survival. May we learn from these experiences, honor those who have suffered, and work toward a future where we understand our place within nature rather than in opposition to it. And may we always remember that, in the end, in the face of all the human and natural violence that they witnessed, life persists, adapts and continues, just as the Lord God commanded from the beginning of creation.